Good evening and welcome back to the devotional series Encounters with Christ. Tonight we're going to hear the account from Simon of Cyrene.
Little did Simon know that this Friday would go down in history when he made the long journey to celebrate Passover in Jerusalem.
After the video we'll post some thoughts, some questions for you to think about, and a prayer and a song that you can listen to in your own personal reflection.
But before we watch the account from Simon of Cyrene, we want to give you a little bit of context.
Simon was likely one of the multitudes of Jews who were on a pilgrimage from their hometowns to the city of Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover festival.
Although we can't be certain that Simon was indeed Jewish, his name is Jewish, and the North African port city of Cyrene had a large Jewish population.
The account from Mark also identifies Simon as the father of Alexander and Rufus. We're not told in the Bible if this was Simon's one and only opportunity to travel to Jerusalem to celebrate Passover, or if this was a regular occurrence. Regardless, Simon's holiday was about to be disrupted in a way that would change him forever.
Although the text does not specifically mention a conversion experience by Simon due to this episode of carrying the cross of Jesus, tradition suggests that the events of Jesus' death so influenced Simon that he did indeed become a follower of Jesus at the conclusion of the cross.
Simon was one of the thousands of random pilgrims among the crowds of people who happened to cross Jesus' path on his way to the cross. By Roman law, Simon was forced to assist Jesus in the humiliating task of carrying the cross of a criminal that would be used in execution outside the gates of the city.
Jesus was being led from the city out to the hillside of Calvary, where he would be crucified. The streets of Jerusalem were crowded with hordes of people who were in town for the Passover celebration.
As was the custom of that day, those who were sentenced to be crucified were forced to carry their execution instrument on their shoulders and backs as another form of public humiliation. John's Gospel notes that Jesus carried his own cross. At least he started to walk with the cross on his shoulders.
However, the brutal 15 hours that led to these moments caused him to buckle under the weight of the cross as sheer exhaustion set in on him.
Biblical scholar William Hendrickson notes that what Jesus bore in those hours leading up to the march to Golgotha was so severe, it is a wonder Jesus was able to stand and carry his cross at all.
Jesus, in the 15 hours before he made his way to Calvary, endured the tense atmosphere of the upper room,
the betrayal by Judas,
the agonies of Gethsemane,
the desertion by his disciples,
the torture of a totally hypocritical trial,
the mockery in the palace of Caiaphas,
the denial by his most prominent disciple Peter,
the trial before an unjust judge,
the terrible ordeal of being lashed,
the pronouncement of a death sentence upon him,
and finally, the abuse by the soldiers leading up to the cross being laid upon his back.
Scholars differ as to whether Jesus carried the full cross or just a horizontal cross beam. This beam normally weighed between 30 to 40 pounds, with the full cross weighing in excess of 100 pounds depending on the type of wood. Regardless, it was an excruciatingly difficult and humiliating weight to bear after being inflicted with all that Jesus had endured to this point.
John's Gospel notes that Jesus at least started out on the way to the cross by bearing it himself. However, at some point along the way, the Roman soldiers who were escorting Jesus to Calvary pulled Simon into service. It was their right to force such a service, being that they were Roman soldiers with such legal parameters.
The Greek word in Mark 15 verse 21 to compel or force Simon to carry the cross of Jesus is the word agarou. Jesus used this same word in Matthew when he was teaching his followers to go to the second mile with people who ask you to help them. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles.
This episode took place on the day before the Jewish Sabbath, which has come to be referred to as Good Friday. Because Matthew chapter 26 verse 45 notes that from the 6th hour there was a darkness all over the land until the 9th hour. It's inferred that Jesus' walk to Calvary took place sometime in the morning.
The 6th hour is noon, and the 9th hour would be 3 p.m. The logical time that Jesus made his way to his execution was sometime during mid to late morning.
The streets would have been alive at this time, and people who were on pilgrimage from the countryside would be heading into the city on their way to prepare for the Passover meal later that evening. This is when Simon and Jesus cross paths.
The scene takes place in Jerusalem on the way to the cross.
Some scholars suggest that Jesus may have made it to the city gates before being met by Simon and others who were on their way into the town. Regardless, their paths met at the time when Jesus needed assistance carrying the cross. Simon was within reach of the hands of the Roman soldiers and took up the cross of Jesus and began to make his way back outside the city gates.
Executions took place outside the city gates as a symbolic way to show the distancing of individuals from society that they had wronged by their actions.
It was a further humiliation to a people who were deeply invested in community and their roots of ancestry. To be executed outside the confines of a city was to be banished from society. It was not only customary for executions to take place outside the city gates, but it was also the law, as indicated in such texts as Exodus 29 verse 14 and Leviticus chapter 4 verse 12.
Why did Simon end up carrying the cross of Jesus? The answer is quite simple, yet shameful.
It was because no other disciple was present to do what a stranger was forced to do. Simon was called into service to carry the cross as one coming after Jesus. Without realising it at the time, Simon fulfilled the words Jesus had spoken that are recorded in Luke chapter 9 verse 23.
And Jesus said to all, "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me."
Tradition indicates that this cross-carrying episode so moved Simon to the core of his being that he did indeed become a follower of Jesus.
The words of Jesus from the cross may have so impacted Simon that he never got over what he experienced that day.
He assisted the Passover lamb to his death, and that death would be the substitutionary death for all who would call on Jesus' name to forgive them and rescue them from sin, death, Satan, and hell.